LLC. Welcome Dr. James McHugh, who is our Fulbright visiting scholar in North American integration for 2014. I think a lot of you know a little bit about Jim. I'll speak a bit about his bio here. Jim, of course, is currently a professor and former chair at the University of Akron in Ohio. His research and teaching focus on political philosophy, public law, and comparative politics, particularly the study of Canada and North America. Prior to becoming professor and chair at Akron, he taught at Roosevelt University in Chicago. He served as associate director of the Center for North American Studies at American University in Washington, D.C. He formerly served as the secretary-treasurer of the Association for Canadian Studies in the United States, AXIS, and is the editor-in-chief of the New England Journal of Political Science. He holds degrees in 3 different countries. He got his bachelor's degree from the University of Vermont, which is his home state, a master's degree from the University of Edinburgh in Scotland. It wasn't in political science.
No, it was in history.
History, that's right. But then he came back to the plantation and went to the PhD at Queen's University in political science. He also served as an infantry officer in the United States Army and Army Reserve, including a platoon leader in the 10th Mountain Division, which I always like to say is just across the border pretty much with Queen's University.
Poised for invasion.
As they always say, if the Americans invade, it will be the 10th Mountain Division. It will be the spearhead. I also mentioned the Fulbright Visiting Research Chair in North American Integration is sponsored by the Faculty of Public Affairs at Carleton University and administered by the Canada-U.S. Fulbright program. So Jim has been here since January. Fulbright's always had to come in January, I think, just to get the maximum Canadian weather. not that Ohio is that big a jump. And he's been having a good time working on a couple of projects. One is his project on the Canadian Senate, and he might talk about that if he wants. But the other main one is looking at developing a hypothetical North American Charter of Rights, which is what he's going to be talking about today. So I'm going to finally stop talking and turn it over to Jim McHugh.
Oh, thanks very much, John. And I was going to mention that the idea of an invasion from Fort Drum into Canada was the subject of a book that had been written by a research associate at Queen's who was actually psychology, had nothing to do with political science or anything like that, which, a lot of people interpreted as, this sort of interesting observation of how something like that might be possible, etc., except I actually knew the person, and he was dead serious. He truly believed an invasion of Canada was imminent, and that's the whole reason that Fort Drum had been upgraded from a camp to a fort with the 10th Mountain Division, even though it had no organic transportation of its own and no ability to do much of anything. So it was interesting what you come across sometimes. And so I hope is this paper, which it's the basis of a book that I began working on when I was at the Woodrow Wilson Center for International Scholars in 2010. And I have the opportunity to come back to it because, fortunately, I'm here right now. And this idea of a hypothetical Charter of Rights for North America the book itself is not about advocacy, but it's about the way in which instruments such as a Charter of Rights actually provides a way of thinking about regionalism. And in this case, about whether or not we can define something that we could call a North American region. Now, let me back up on a couple of areas here to sort of explain this context. First of all, there are many regions in the world that have their own regional Charter of Rights that have been, South America, the Americas has one, Africa has one, Europe has one. That some people might regard as being redundant, because is there not already a universal Declaration of Human Rights? Are there not international charters that already exist? And one of the explanations for having a regional Charter of Rights is that regions are distinct, and they have their own distinct interpretation of human rights, and they need to be protected and given special credence, etc. But the other explanation is that charters of rights actually serve as a way of defining the region itself and defining the political goals and the political identity of the countries that make up that region. So, for example, the African Charter on Human Rights and People's Rights, which was first introduced in the 1970s, I believe, was in many ways an expression of the political aspirations for sub-Saharan African unity. And it was intended really as a way of galvanizing support for an idea of regional identity as it was for trying to promote human rights. In other words, human rights charters are often as much or more about the state than it is about individual people and protecting their rights. And that in some ways these charters may be redundant only because what they're really expressing are values and laws and protections that already exist in those countries, and they want to make this big statement of this is what we're all about. These are the values that actually unite us. This is part of our distinct identity. So in creating a hypothetical North American Charter of Rights, I'm actually using it as a way of exploring this idea of whether or not North America has a coherent identity as a region. And that's a very controversial issue because in many respects people perceive the North American community as really being purely economically based. You know, everything is really grounded on NAFTA. It is a instrument that is designed to facilitate trade that already was fairly large among these three adjacent countries, and really there's not much more to it. Like Mexico and Canada really don't have much in common with each other, and they're never going to. Well, one of the things that spurred my interest is the growing interest in this notion of a convergence of values. And this is something that many scholars have explored in the last couple of decades. Bob Pastor at American University was a very big proponent of this idea of a convergence of values. Bastañez, Engelhardt, and Nevitz instrumental scholarship on this area. And there have been also statistical studies that have demonstrated a growing convergence of values. So, in part, I wanted to use this as a way of shaping what those convergent values might look like if you express them in the form of a Charter of Rights. And in doing so, you have to take into account also the fact that even if values are converging, there are going to be differences. And this is true of all charters. The United States, for example, has imposed reservations on many different international treaties dealing with human rights. Notably, for example, dealing with whether or not you can execute minors. The United States imposed a reservation because Texas wants to be able to execute its minors if it so chooses, and doesn't see that as a human rights violation. So you're going to get these kinds of reservations anyway. But when you're constructing this kind of a charter, you actually have to address them up front. What sorts of things do we commonly accept, and what sorts of things do we have to leave out because there are differences among us? One area, for example, that I have not addressed yet in this study, and I'm still pondering it, is the issue of language and language rights. Because it can be very touchy, particularly in, first of all, Canada, because of the issue of bilingualism, but especially in the United States, which, in which people have, the idea of, the English language being under siege. It's another one of these interesting phenomena where the dominant language or the dominant culture perceives itself as somehow being under siege because it's somehow being challenged in some ways. I know from personal experience that there are people in the United States who just think that the Spanish language is going to swallow up the United States, that they're going to be forced to speak Spanish and things of that nature. And when you sort of sit down and talk rationally about it, and they start to see, for example, I was mentioning the fact that, well, if you're from a Spanish-speaking country and you want your children to succeed, you want them to go to college, if they're not going to learn English as a fluent first language, where are they going to go to college except to go overseas? Or, in some person goes, well, they'll go to the University of Puerto Rico. Is it all of them? This is where, so it becomes an interesting exercise also in how one manages public opinion, etc. But one of the ways to think about it also is in terms of international relations. And that was, that's one of the theoretical, first things theoretically that I'm dealing with in this particular book. Human rights charters do not necessarily improve the protection of human beings. States can and often do promote human rights education, promote human rights charters, and promote human rights awareness as a way of defining themselves, as a way of making statements about themselves. So when they do it regionally, this is also a way of trying to cement a sense of commonality. And in international relations theory, and I'm not generally an IR person, I dabble in IR, as Michael Hawes always likes to point out. I'm not really an IR person, and that's true. But I've become increasingly fascinated by the possibilities of IR theory and the way it's been developing in recent years. And the people who've looked at charters from an IR perspective have noted that there are different ways that you could approach it theoretically, from a rationalist perspective, from an institutionalist perspective, from a civilization studies approach. And what's interesting is in all three approaches there's an overlap. All of them deal with the concept of cultural identity and sovereignty and ways to reconcile differences among states in those particular areas. So again, it kind of reinforces this idea of using this as an instrument for exploring this notion of a North American identity. And regionalism is an important theme because of, again, much of the literature on the post-Cold War shift in polarity, from a bipolar world to, some people argue, a unipolar world where the United States is the only remaining superpower, or in terms of multipolar centers of power, which reinforces, and both of them can reinforce the importance of regional development, regional identity, regional associations. Unipolar theories often focus on the way in which regions come together to deal with the presence of a single superpower and to seek alternatives to that dominance. And multipolar theories, in some ways, do the same thing. In some ways argue that if other powers are going to emerge that maybe not as dominant as the United States, but are still pretty important, they're going to be at the center of a regional identity. And that latter one is particularly interesting in terms of NAFTA, because in some ways what the United States has attempted to do, at least economically, is to create its own region, sort of to bolster its position by saying, well, we might not remain the dominant superpower forever, but we can certainly remain the dominant power in one of the most dominant regions in the world. And some people might argue this is part of the motivation for the United States to continue to hang on to this idea of a North American community, even as domestic politics occasionally becomes very shrill and angst-ridden about the idea of losing sovereignty or all of the other things that come along with an isolationist concern about the implications of regional development. So the next thing to do is to explore these areas where there may be a convergence of values. And the biggest finding in the studies that have been done on values has been, not surprisingly, that a convergence of values is occurring, but much of it is occurring in areas that are directly affected by economic changes. That as Mexico becomes more liberalized in its economic structures and in its international trade relations, and as Canada and the United States continue to be, to have liberal economies, and in some ways the classic liberal elements have been strengthened in recent years. The Republicans of the late 20th century and the Reagan Revolution, and certainly Stephen Harper in the last few years, and the free trade movement under Brian Mulroney, etc., that these things have created a common basis for certain liberal values. And so NAFTA is in many ways an expression of a willingness to build a regional community on the basis of shared market values. So NAFTA can lead to liberal markets. Liberal markets can lead to liberal values. And liberal values can lead, therefore, to greater regional cultural convergence, at least in those areas. Now, if you're going to construct a hypothetical charter of any sorts that involves three distinct countries, you also have to take into account the differences. And, we're familiar, of course, with Canada. Canada is a liberal democratic country, but it has a strong communitarian influence. Certainly has been identified in certain elite quarters although I have argued in other writings that sometimes that's exaggerated, that the liberal presence in Canada is a very strong one nonetheless, and that the emphasis on communitarianism is as much a consequence of what I call negative nationalism as anything else. And negative nationalism is a term I use to basically express the idea that we are Canadians because we're not Americans. And therefore, you define yourself by what you're not. And I have found that often is an interesting phenomenon that occurs in that respect. But certainly in terms of other features of the development of Canada historically, bilingualism, multiculturalism, the development of Canada's parliamentary democracy, the fact that it is a strong parliamentary democracy, and those institutional changes and features do make a difference in terms of the way that Canada shapes its political values. The presence of Quebec and the influence that Quebec has had in shaping the political debate in Canada, etc. Those are all things that are unique to Canada in certain ways, and so are not necessarily part of the, so have to be taken into account if you're going to talk about developing a regional identity. Same thing is true in Mexico. Mexico, like the rest of Latin America, has been influenced by some classic conservative values. A traditional sense of hierarchy, an emphasis on patriarchy and the role of the family. Not as strongly as it was historically centuries ago, but certainly still present. The way in which the Catholic Church shapes sort of that worldview is still somewhat known. The concept of la raza, the concept of of national identity, which you find expressed within Mexico's constitution. And also its presidential system of government, which has a very strong centralizing influence that's breaking down now to a certain extent ever since the lack of uniparty dominance, one-party dominance by the PRI. That has begun to shift somewhat. And some people will say it's coincided with the development of NAFTA and the liberalization of Mexico's economy and its relationships, etc. But these are factors, again, that are going to have to be taken into account. If you're going to talk about commonality, you're also going to have to talk about lack of that. In the United States, which has had a long duel between 18th century Republican values and classic liberal values, which has a presidential democracy. It's based very much on a concept of non-responsible government. And then also, and here's one of the most interesting differences between the United States, Canada, and Mexico. The United States Bill of Rights really was developed as a guarantee against the concern that a federal government was going to take liberties away from people. This was a way of although in many ways it was really a way of strengthening the role of the state governments, not necessarily of the individual people. But it was focused, because it came out of the 18th century, it was focused very much on civil rather than human rights. It was very much a product of 18th century liberal ideas. And in contrast, Mexico and Canada developed their charters of rights in the 20th century. And Canada in particular, with the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, developed in 1982, reflected a post-World War II understanding of rights, which was much more human rights oriented, which includes civil rights. Civil rights are part of human rights, but they're more expansive. Civil rights are, as the name implies, the rights of citizens. Human rights are the rights of all humans, and that has some real implications for the development of regional charters, etc. Are you going to come at this from a civil rights perspective or a human rights perspective? The United States, much more comfortable dealing at least judicially with civil rights and dealing maybe legislatively with human rights. Mexico and Canada have become more comfortable with dealing judicially with the concept of human rights. So that's, these are some of the things that you have to take into account. So then the next question is, what would such a charter possibly look like, and how would we use that to sort of explore some of these ideas? So I'm just going to take a moment and read some of the passages. The way the book is being constructed is, after a couple of introductory chapters that explores these concepts that I just mentioned, I'm actually going to lay out, and this is something I've done. This is something I've done with my Senate book as well. I've said, here are the different clauses of a proposed amendment, and I'm going to comment on each one and why it's in here and what its implications would be. And much of that comes from my recent fascination with neo-institutionalism. And maybe I'm just going to back up for a second and explain what I mean by that. When I was a graduate student, many centuries ago, I was taught methods of analysis. That was one of the great things I learned at Queen's, was to do comparison by using actual methods of analysis and not merely, say, comparing, apples and oranges. Among the methods of analysis that was first trotted out was the formal legal approach, and it was trotted out as an example of how not to do it. Because it was based on a very old, especially early 20th century, way of analyzing politics, which took formal institutions and formal documents and used them at face value to describe. So Dawson's Government of Canada is a really good example, where he would often describe the institutions at face value in ways that made it appear as though the monarchy and the Senate were all really huge, important players, rather than focusing on the real source of power, prime ministerial dominance, party discipline, where the House of Commons itself isn't even really that important, by comparison anymore. One of the examples I like to use my students when I teach them about the formal legal approach is I use the Constitution Act of 1867. And I said, if you were to rely on your knowledge of Canada by reading the Constitution Act of 1867, you would be convinced that first, Queen Victoria is still alive. Secondly, she runs the country. Thirdly, the Senate is the most dominant chamber in the parliamentary system. And fourthly, there's no such thing as a prime minister because it's not mentioned anywhere. So there's some real danger. So understandably, the formal legal approach was abandoned. But in recent years, some people have returned to institutionalism and said, well, you know what? There's a more sophisticated way to use institutions to explore the way politics actually works. Because institutions do matter. In the same way, and this is my analogy, but I use the analogy of a maze. If you put a mouse in a maze and you change the maze, the mouse is going to change direction. The mouse is going to change behavior in response to it. And the mouse might actually come to the conclusion that the cheese is just not worth it. Screw it. I'm not going to, The same thing can happen in terms of institutions. But institutions also themselves have a culture, have a raison d'etre. They were not just created because people enjoy playing with Tinker Toys. They were created because there's a real, motivating factor here. Often cultural, and political culture is one of my favorite methods of analysis, but also often in terms of an understanding of power, an understanding of history, an understanding of human nature, particularly from a realist perspective. There's various ways that you can use institutions to illustrate this kind of point. So, I often will do that. I'll present, I'll say, I'm the negotiator, and I'm the one who drafted this document. Here's an article from this doctorate. Why did I put that in here? What is this really reflecting? So, I pattern in part, I use the model of other regional charters of rights as a way of, sort of organizing and so in this case I have Chapter 2, Civil and Political Rights. So there's going to be a section in this charter on civil and political rights. Article 1, Property Rights. Section 1. Everyone has the right to use and the use and enjoyment of property. That protected property may be derived from personality, physical being, possessions, investments, intellect, labor, inheritance, and other forms of legal acquisitions. Those kinds of specifications actually reflect the growing importance of non-material property rights, such as intellectual property. But it can also reflect a historical importance, especially in countries such as Mexico, of the dignity of labor that's enshrined in Mexico's constitution. It can therefore be much more all-encompassing in terms of understanding that different political traditions have different understandings of exactly what constitutes property that ought to be protected. But it can bring it all together within a converging value of the importance of property rights as central to any well-functioning economic system. So within the context of NAFTA, of course, intellectual property is something that has been discussed, is a consideration. How do we deal with that? How do we assess whether or not a country has been subsidizing unfairly in contravention of this? Is a particular government service unfairly subsidizing a labor force or not? It doesn't necessarily solve the problem, but it compels a consideration of the way in which countries would deal with it from then on, and would agree that, yes, we have this common core of believing that certain property rights are essential. Now we have to sort of smooth over the nuanced differences among the three of us. So in Section 2, no person may be deprived of property by state authority except for reasons of public utility or social interest, as sanctioned expressly by law, and not without just compensation according to forms established by the legal system of the respective jurisdictions. This is a really touchy area. This particular clause was drafted very carefully. On the one hand, you have an American tradition of eminent domain. But eminent domain has always been presented as something where the assumption is that there's a great deal of impetus on the government to demonstrate that it really needs this property, and also the emphasis that it will provide fair compensation. On the other hand, in other countries, such as Mexico, you can still have this idea, but it's expressed a little bit differently. It may be a little more loosely expressed. It may be expressed more in terms of, we have to understand that from time to time there are certain resources that everybody needs, and so we're going to have to take this from you, such as the redistribution of land, the hacienda system, being broken down into something that is considered fair and equitable. So again, it doesn't necessarily arrive at a definitive overriding continental definition of this term, but it acknowledges that there is, on the one hand, a common acceptance that this idea that property should not be taken except for good reason, and if it is taken for good reason, there should be compensation, and the justification, the rationale, and the purposes for which that might be done. And that's the sort of thing that could address, for example, Canadian companies that invest in Mexico or in the United States and find that they are being subject to action that they were not anticipating, and at least being able to address it and to say, wait a minute, this is a violation of this section. And then it forces a discussion. It forces the countries to try to come to grips with the fact that they have to find in this overlap more areas of commonality. Section 3 is even more interesting in that respect. The parties to this convention reserve the authority to retain direct proprietary control over the natural resources of their territory. However, the express extension or recognition of a proprietary interest in any of those resources from a relevant government to any person will entitle those persons to all of the property rights otherwise stipulated by this charter. Again, on the one hand, an acknowledgement of a common set of values that private interests have a stake in resources, but on the other hand, there may be an overriding public interest in regulating, if not actually confiscating or compensating for this kind of a property. Certainly Mexico's attitude, as expressed within its constitution, about resources. Resources found under the ground belong to the country. Or must be managed by the country and can be then conferred with the permission of the government. And of course we're talking about oil. We're talking about those kinds of resources. But in Canada, this allows for the issue of a more decentralized federal system and the problem of Section 92A and natural resources, etc. Again, it finds common ground, but it provides these little escape clauses to acknowledge the fact that there are going to be differences among countries. Regional development does not mean, and regional accommodation does not mean that individual countries don't retain certain important distinctions and differences in the way they approach these sorts of things. So finally, Section 4, the parties to this convention will protect persons under their jurisdiction from unlawful private deprivations of property, including from fraud, theft, usury, and other false means. Okay. Yeah. People can't steal from you. We're going to agree on that. So sometimes it's easy. Sometimes again, it's almost as though you're anticipating the potential reservations that might have been imposed by the other countries because they want to make exceptions that reflect a nuanced distinction. So the areas of commonality, as I mentioned before, one of the things that Bassanez, Engelhardt, and Nevitt point out is that there is increased levels of trust. Trust in the political process, trust in government, trust in their neighbors. There is an increased post-materialism, where the emphasis is not so much on accumulation, but on quality of life. And a greater generational cosmopolitanism. Younger people are more cosmopolitan in their thinking. They're more willing to think beyond their borders. They are less parochial in that respect. Those things are going to continue to motivate this kind of exercise. So when you get to, I have here in Article 9, freedom of conscience and religion. Again, very touchy area. All three countries acknowledge that freedom of religion, freedom of conscience is important, but the way in which they frame it, the way in which they impose limitations may be a bit different. So in Clause 2, the freedom to express and disseminate beliefs may be subject only to those limitations that are necessary to protect public safety, order, and the rights and liberties of other persons. Again, in many ways, you're kind of hedging all bets, because you might find one country is more interested in the effect of religion on public order, and another might be more interested on the effect that it can have on the rights of other people. And this kind of allows for room to maneuver on both ends. So a charter is not establishing a common regional acceptance of values, is actually providing the opportunity for a conversation on the similarities and the differences. It's giving a focal point so that when these three countries interact among themselves, they are able to address those differences as well as the similarities and find a way to sort of hash them out. And again, the experience in Europe, the experience in Africa in this respect, I think is very informative. And that this sort of thing has also occurred, I think in Europe in particular. You've had examples of countries such as, say, Britain, which finds itself being subject to a clause in the European Charter of Human Rights that it historically would have interpreted very differently from continental Europe, and now having to negotiate through a judicial process as well as through a political process ways of accommodating its traditional interpretation of these rights with the way in which other bodies within Europe might otherwise interpret them. So it provides really a context for, and a commitment to, exploring a greater sense of a continental community. And one of the words that's often used very carefully among people who study North America is cooperation. The title of the Fulbright chair here is North American Integration, and often people who study North America cringe a little bit, saying, "Oh, no, put that word out because that drives certain people crazy." And I know when I was at American University, that was one of the things that was sort of stamped on our desk is use the word cooperation, not integration. This is a good example of a way in which that kind of a strategy can be used to diffuse some of the anxiety that sometimes arises among people who continue to place more faith in the power of the state than in regional or international relations for dealing with the 21st century. So again, if you approach these kinds of institutions from that perspective, they can be interesting ways to explore common areas. They can be interesting ways to facilitate discussions about remaining differences. But they are often, more than anything else, a statement of desire, a desire that this is the direction in which we want to go, and this is an instrument that we're going to use to help facilitate that process. So that's essentially what my book is about. It's just also kind of a fun, again, I enjoy institutional tinkering. It is fun. It is like playing with Tinker Toys sometimes. But in order really to enjoy it, you have to think through, why am I sticking this in this little hole when it doesn't work like that? Oh, I know, because I want it to do this, or that, or the other thing, because I think this is really cool. And being allowed to do that as an academic is always a real treat, I think. So this book is a way of sort of exploring the big picture. So that's pretty much what I've been working on. Now it's really a matter of my filling in the gaps, filling in the details, which I'm hoping I can do by the end of the summer. We're working on it. So, but obviously I would welcome very much your feedback and your reactions to it. So, and hopefully this can help spur a discussion among ourselves. So,
Great.
thanks.
Thanks very much, Jim.